Blood is an amazing tissue. It consists of primarily water, and that's going to be what we call the plasma component of blood, and it will have some other dissolved things, but most of plasma is water. Then we have the formed elements. The formed elements consist of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And interestingly, all three of those components originate from the same stem cell. And some differences in that stem cell's development determine whether it becomes a red blood cell, a white blood cell, or fragments into pieces to become platelets. Platelets are significant in blood clotting. White blood cells are significant in the immune system's function, which we'll get to in the next chapter. And then red blood cells obviously are for carrying oxygen. So how about a little bit of math for us here? We have some red blood cells on the left here, and the picture on the right has red blood cells flowing through a capillary. So that gives you an idea of exactly how small these red blood cells are. But in the middle is the key component to this whole thing. This is a hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin molecules are what actually carry oxygen on the red blood cell. So if we look at that molecule, it's fairly complex, but it has 4 heme groups in it. Each heme group has an iron molecule in it. That's the little red ball. So we can say that each heme group is capable of carrying 1 molecule of oxygen. So if there are 4 heme groups, that means that each molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So that's starting to form our math equation here. We have 4 molecules of oxygen per hemoglobin molecule. The next question is, how many molecules of hemoglobin are there in a red blood cell? And the answer to that is somewhere on the order of 250 million. So if we do the math on that, 4 molecules of oxygen per hemoglobin, 250 hemoglobin molecules per million hemoglobin molecules per red blood cell, we're looking at somewhere on the order of a billion with a B, molecules of oxygen carried per red blood cell. Now we're getting into some really, really big numbers here. So if there are a billion molecules of oxygen per red blood cell, how many red blood cells are there in circulation? The answer to that is very difficult to calculate because it can vary so much from one person to the next. But a low-end estimate would be 4 million red blood cells per microliter of blood. And your body would contain blood in the form of quarts, not microliters. So we're probably looking at hundreds of thousands, millions of microliters, millions of red blood cells each. So it is a conservative estimate of over 1 trillion red blood cells in circulation at any one time. So let's just say 1 trillion red blood cells carrying a billion molecules of oxygen each, and now that number will absolutely max out a calculator. The point here is your body has an incredible ability to carry oxygen throughout the system. So really what that means is you need all of that oxygen to live for 5 minutes. If you don't take another breath within the next 5 minutes, you'll likely die. And that means you ran out of oxygen to the point where the brain stopped working. So the ability to carry oxygen in this way is amazing and also essential to continued life. Red blood cells have a relatively short lifespan, and that is because they do not have the ability to repair themselves. So they're made, they do their job, and when they start wearing out, they just die. So a red blood cell will live somewhere between 90 and 120 days, at which point it will die. That means about every 3 to 4 months, you need to completely replace your red blood cell supply. So those trillion plus red blood cells have to be replaced every 3 to 4 months. So that really means that your bones are constantly, specifically long bones, bones you would find in the arms and legs, are constantly making red blood cells to try to keep up with the rate of loss. And one estimate that the book utilizes is something on the order of 2 million red blood cells dying every second. So 2 million red blood cells dying every second. That means you need to make about 2 million new red blood cells every second to keep your red blood cell count adequate. And someone who has anemia basically has a shortage of red blood cells. And there can be a whole list of reasons why that would be the case, but if you're short on red blood cells, then you're short on oxygen carrying capacity. What is it that triggers the production of more red blood cells? That is actually regulated by the kidneys. So if the kidneys become oxygen deprived, they will release a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. And that hormone will then stimulate the bone marrow in those long bones to become more aggressive about making red blood cells, to speed up the red blood cell production process. And that then is the way that your body monitors and manipulates red blood cell levels. So if the kidneys are doing good on oxygen, the rate of red blood cell production is pretty stable. If the kidneys become deprived, then the rate of red blood cell production goes up. And this is what allows a person to become more physically fit or more capable of greater performance. Some of you perhaps could go out right now and run a mile. And at the end of that mile, you would feel relatively good. If I were to try to run a mile, I'm not sure I could do that and actually survive the experience. So one key difference between those of you who can do that and those of us who can't do that is the red blood cell count. So the better shape you're in, the higher your red blood cell count is, meaning it's capable of carrying oxygen to support that kind of activity. So one thing that will happen as a person is, let's say, trying to get into shape, is you push the body to a greater performance level than it's comfortable with based on red blood cell count. This then deprives the kidneys of oxygen, and if you do this enough, they will then release EPO and trigger more red blood cells to be produced, which then means once those additional red blood cells are produced, now you have a greater oxygen carrying capacity, now you have a greater physical performance ability. If you were to go, let's say, from here in western Kentucky, perhaps, to Denver, Colorado. Denver has a significantly higher elevation than we're at here in Kentucky, and so that means the oxygen concentration will be lower. So your red blood cell count is calibrated to perform at the level it needs to where you live. But you go then to somewhere with a lower oxygen concentration, and what that means is that it takes more red blood cells to capture enough oxygen to support you. So now your red blood cell count is low compared to what you need in that higher elevation, lower oxygen concentration in Denver. Something as simple as walking across the airport and you'd be out of breath. After a week or so of being there, you would then discover that you feel like you can do there what you could do here, and that's because your kidneys released EPO, red blood cell production increased, and now you have enough red blood cells to capture that lesser amount of oxygen. Then you come back from there to western Kentucky again, and now you have a higher red blood cell count than you need, so then EPO levels will go down because the kidneys are supersaturated with oxygen, but for a short period of time, until those red blood cells die out of the system, you have a supercharged physical performance ability. So if you could comfortably run a mile here, you achieved the ability to comfortably run a mile in Denver, then you come back here, now you can run a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles, and still feel the same as you would after running a mile originally. Now, because they're only going to live for that 90 to 120 days time frame, and because the kidneys are not maintaining that level of red blood cell production, you have only a couple of months tops to have that increased performance ability, unless you utilize it and then push the envelope a little farther to keep it, but that would take a fair bit of work. And speaking for myself, I'm lazy enough that I wouldn't be interested in doing that. To me, running is something that I do when I'm late for a meal and about to miss it, not something I do because I find it fun. For those of you who do find running fun, well, I worry about you, but you'll probably be in better health. Another thing about blood is that it comes in 4 different blood types. And a blood type has to do with what kind of antigen is found on the red blood cell and what type of antibody is floating around in the plasma. So an antigen is an identifier for that red blood cell. An antibody is an immune system functionality that is looking for things that don't belong and attempting to kill it, or in this case, attempting to coagulate it and cause it to clump together so it can be isolated and, in theory, not cause any additional problems. So you can have type A, B, or O blood. Type A has type A antigens on the red blood cell and anti-B antibodies in the plasma. Type B has type B antigen on the red blood cell and anti-A in the plasma. Type AB blood has both A and B antigens on it, but no antibodies in the blood. And then type O has no antigens on the red blood cell, but both anti-A and anti-B antibodies in the plasma. Obviously, if you're type A blood, you would like to receive type A blood in a blood transfusion if you need it. If you're type B, you'd like to receive type B. But if a type A person receives type B blood, this is going to be a serious problem. The anti-B in the A will cause the B cells to clump together. The anti-A in the B will cause the A cells to clump together, and you would get massive blood clotting throughout the body just by mixing the wrong kinds of blood together. So the antibodies would cause the red blood cells with the antigen that they are for to clump, to coagulate, and the thought is it's taking this foreign particle, or what it considers to be a foreign particle based on shape recognition, and clumping it up. And that seems like a good idea, except for blood, when it clumps, actually causes circulatory collapse. So systemic blood clotting will actually kill a person. Now, if you have type O blood, the Red Cross loves you because type O blood is a universal donor. Because it has no antigens on the red blood cells, it is compatible enough with either A, B, or AB that the clumping that occurs will be minimal and you can survive the experience. Now, obviously, it's better if you get the specific blood type that you are, but O will work in a pinch for anybody. So O is the universal donor, which means the Red Cross can sell your blood to anyone who needs it. If you happen to be type AB blood, and by the way, type O is the most common blood type across the world. Type AB is the least common blood type across the world. And so if O is the universal donor, AB is a universal recipient. Because it has no antibodies in its plasma at all, it can receive any blood type with minimal clumping involved in the process. Now, obviously, it's better if you get type AB. That's obviously a more compatible mix, but in a pinch, AB can get anything. And again, the clumping that might occur from that would be minimal and something you can survive. You don't get a blood transfusion because you're just a little low on blood. You get it because you're going to die if you don't. So again, a little bit of clumping here or there when it keeps you alive is a fair price to pay. Now, if you're type O, you can donate to anybody, but you can only get type O blood. So if you want to do good for others, I suppose you want to be type O. If you want to be a survivor under any circumstances requiring a blood transfusion, you want to be type AB. So anyway, those are the 4 different blood types there and the compatibility issues with it. So before you ever receive a blood transfusion, they should type your blood, which is a test that determines under what circumstances does your blood clot, under what circumstances does it not clot, and that then tells them what blood type you are and what blood type they should give you. So here's the idea of a type A blood of donor, and you then receive, let's say, type A blood, and because the antibodies for B don't match up with the antigens of A, these are normally present, then you don't get binding, you don't get clumping. If, however, type A blood is donated to a type B recipient, The anti-B and the A will cause the B to clump together, the anti-A and the B will cause the A to clump together, and what you get is over here on the right. Red blood cells actually tied together with these antibodies. Now, it doesn't really interfere with their function. They can still carry oxygen just fine, but the problem is that they clump into such large bundles that they cannot go through capillaries. Remember in the image of the capillary earlier, they were going through one at a time. And if they're bound up with all these antibodies, then they won't be able to fit through, and then you lose circulation. Another concept of blood is the Rh factor. So along with that type, A, B, or O, there can be a positive or negative associated with it. So some of you might be O positive or A negative or something like that. And so that negative or positive is called the Rh factor. And that's a way that the immune system identifies what belongs and what doesn't. So that's part of the name tag of the cell from an immune system identification standpoint. And if you have an Rh negative mother, so a O negative or an A negative or whatever negative mother who has a positive baby because the dad was positive, then the red blood cells from the baby would be identified by the mother as foreign invaders, and the mother would then mount an immune system reaction to kill it. In a best case scenario, now normally these blood cells should not mix. Mama's blood should never mix with baby's blood until the point of birth. So during the pregnancy itself, probably not an issue, but occasionally blood does cross the placenta when it shouldn't. And in that case, if the positives or negatives didn't match up here, then the mama might mount an immune system response, meaning the mama's body might start trying to kill the baby. And that's obviously not what we're looking for there. So best case scenario in that case, the baby might be born anemic because mama's immune system has been actively killing baby's blood. A blood transfusion can fix that. But let's say this is the first pregnancy, so there are no particular concerns there at the moment. When baby's born, there's going to be some baby's blood exposed to mama's blood. And mama's body can then identify that if it's not a match between the negative mama and a possibly positive baby, and then mount an immune system response. In this case, the baby is fine because it was out before the mama's immune system had a chance to do anything in that case. But the mama's immune system becomes sensitized to Rh positive blood. And should another pregnancy come along later with another positive baby, mama's body will be much more aggressive next time at trying to kill that baby because it's been identified as a foreign invader from the very beginning, and that's just the way the immune system does, is it kills things that it doesn't recognize. So this used to be a serious cause of serious anemia for babies born at birth. Babies actually not being born alive because mama's body was killing the baby when it found it. So it was a big enough problem that we've developed a solution, and that's called a RhoGAM shot. And a RhoGAM shot basically counteracts this positive blood that might be present in the system before the mama's body has a chance to really recognize it and deal with it. So in essence, it's canceling out the immune system reaction that would have occurred. This then means that if mama's body identifies a second baby that's Rh positive, for example, the immune system responds as if it's the first time that's ever happened. In a later chapter, we'll talk about the immune system and its responses, but the first time an immune system sees something and responds to it, it's called a primary response. That primary response is typically pretty weak, and it doesn't last very long. But a secondary response, something that comes along later that's identified again as the same thing, has a much more powerful response that lasts a lot longer. So what the RhoGAM shot is essentially doing is guaranteeing that if mama's body identifies another Rh positive baby in there, it responds with a primary response, so a weak response that will probably make the baby anemic but probably not kill it, rather than a secondary response which could go in there in a matter of a very short period of time and actually kill that baby. So the RhoGAM shot has greatly improved the health of a lot of babies at birth and allowed a lot of babies to be born that would not have otherwise been born alive. And so all that just had to do with immune system recognition of cells based on their positive or negative Rh factor. So here we would see that happening. The antibodies would start going into the baby's blood and clumping it up. And just like if you mix the wrong blood type in a blood transfusion, you'd get the same kind of thing happening in the baby's body and then cause serious problems, if not death. So the Rh factor, the positive or negative, has nothing to do with adults and adults. It has to do with a mother to a baby. So if daddy is a positive, typically, blood type and mama is a negative blood type, then you're more likely to run into that sort of problem. The RhoGAM shot can be administered before birth, at birth, or a couple of days after birth, and it's up to the individual doctor as to how they want to do that. Some doctors will actually blood type the baby to see what type it is and then determine if the shot is necessary or not. But it's probably pretty common that the doctor just gives the shot, and then you don't have to worry about what it was or wasn't. It's taken care of either way. Blood transfusion is the last big topic that we really want to talk about in the world of blood. And so there's going to be a whole separate video on that I'll post along with this. And what we'll do with that is look at the Red Cross's website and their standards for blood transfusion or for blood donation. And it's kind of surprising probably, and to me quite concerning, what's happening in the world of blood donation and what the requirements are no longer being held to. So we'll leave that to that video. But blood donation is something that is certainly a common thing, and a lot of people do it. Sometimes with the idea of saving lives, sometimes with, for me when I was in high school, with the idea of I get out of running in gym class that day, and I might get a free t-shirt, or I might get some stale pizza or something like that was a motivator. But whatever it happens to be, that's an option for you. And so after you watch the blood donation video I'll post along with this one, then you can form your conclusions on how you feel about the overall process. So hopefully everything made sense. You learned a lot. And so we'll have a good day. We'll see you next time.